So hello everyone. I'm going to go through a lot of Reiff stuff. There's a lot of numbers to go through, so I need you guys to stick with me. And yeah, it might take a little bit. Riley Reiff had a 71.2 Pro Football Focus grade. He had 8 penalties, 5 sacks allowed. And I'm going to compare him to some of the free agent guys that are coming out so far right here, because I don't think we can necessarily expect us, day one starting left tackle at 25. We could be talking about the 5th, maybe even 6th best tackle left on the board, unless someone just unrealistically falls for whatever reason, because draft weirdness. But comparing him to free agents at least, Andrew Whitworth had a 72.8 grade, 14 penalties, and 1 sack allowed. Costanzo, 81.3, 2 penalties, and 3 sacks allowed. Then you have Beecham at 67.3, with 9 penalties and 4 sacks allowed. And I will point out a thing here, because how your guard plays greatly affects how your tackle plays. And a lot of people don't like to acknowledge that oftentimes. So they'll be like, oh, I saw him get beat around the outside. That tackle is the problem. Well, unless that tackle has to worry about the inside because your guard has no, pass blocking competence, in which case you have a problem. And so we go to Pat Elflein here at 64.8 PFF grade, had 8 penalties and 6 sacks allowed, which 6 sacks on the interior is ridiculous. Austin Corbett for Andrew Whitworth's left guard here for the Rams. They had a lot of injuries, so this is their backup guy. He ended up playing more than he probably should have at 51.8 Pro Football Focus grade, 4 penalties, and only allowed 1 sack. So Elflein, based off of, at least the grade, you would have to, assume he was a much better run blocker. And then the outlier here is Quentin Nelson, Costanzo's left guard, at 91.2, 3 penalties, and no sacks allowed. But on the other hand, Costanzo was the only one blowing them out of the water with an 81.3 grade, and he only allowed 3 sacks with 2 penalties. The fact that he had the best left guard of these bunch probably shouldn't be that surprising, given the fact that he played the best. And Alex Lewis, Beecham's guard with the Jets last season, also a backup because of the whole Osemele situation they had go down with. That's different. But he had a Pro Football Focus grade of 56.1. He had 6 penalties and only allowed 2 sacks. So Elflein, by far, was the worst pass blocker of any of these guys, just by the virtue of allowing 6, which is ridiculous. And there are people who would kind of come after me, probably saying, well, we paid Reiff all of this money, and he isn't necessarily worth that money. And if you compare him to guys who have gotten paid recently, or even the division guys, how does he necessarily, stack up? Probably not well. Well, I did that. And Bakhtiari is the first one. Bakhtiari's possibly the best left tackle in the league. So we might have to grain of salt this one a little bit. With a 78.6 Pro Football Focus grade, he had 11 penalties and 2 sacks allowed. Taylor Decker. Well, actually, my bad. I'm going to go to his left guard first. Elgton Jenkins was a rookie. He had a 69.2 grade. Didn't allow a sack and had 8 penalties. The 8 penalties is on par with Elflein, but no sacks versus 6 is also insane. And then you go to Taylor Decker, another high first-round draft pick for the Lions there. Kind of like how, well, I guess I won't say Reiff was high first round, but he was a first-round pick of them. 75.5 Pro Football Focus grade, 10 penalties, and allowed 7 sacks. His guard actually played, this is the most similar guard in terms of grade to Pat Elflein. It's a 64.9 versus Elflein's 64.8. But he still only had 2 penalties and 3 sacks allowed, which once again blows Elflein's 8 and 6 out of the water. And then Charles Leno had a bad season at 58.6 overall here, with 13 penalties and 5 sacks allowed. And James Daniels still performed a ton better than Elflein pretty much ever has, which was a 69.8, 4 penalties and only 1 sack allowed. Now we go to Trent Brown, who was signed last offseason. Is kind of, he played both right and left tackle for the Raiders. Ended up playing more left. What he did was he had a 69.1 grade with 5 penalties and 1 sack allowed. And that 69.1 grade is not as good as Riley's 71.2, obviously. And the difference here, once again, if you just look at the left guard, Richie Incognito was his left guard. He had a 74.0 grade with 8 penalties and 1 sack. So once again, we see another 8 penalty guard, but the difference, 6-1, is also ridiculous. Not to mention a 10-point, increase in overall grading. And then you have DJ Humphries, who just got paid, because once again, comparing him to paid guys, 64.5 Pro Football Focus grade from 2019, 13 penalties and only allowed 2 sacks, and he had Justin Pugh, who is a veteran at left guard, 66.8 overall grade, 2 penalties and 4 sacks allowed, and although that looks not good, that's still a ton better than what Elflein gave us. So, in the grand scheme of things, backup caliber guards usually make tackles play worse. Shouldn't be too surprising. And Andrew Whitworth, I think, is a good example of that because he's one of the best left tackles in the entire league. And although you could say maybe some of it's age, which is true, some of it could be age because he is 38 now. But he still had to work with a 51.8 graded guard next to him for most of the season. So that's going to affect him a little bit. And he still kind of played on par with the Riley Reiff thing. And Elflein did allow that ridiculous 6 sacks, and that would actually make Reiff have to work more inside than he has to do with his outside stuff. Because he almost you can't tell me that's not in his mind in obvious passing downs, where it's like, that is the easiest route to the quarterback. My quarterback is not known to move, so we need to help out this guy before I come in and do my stuff over here. That's usually how this has to work when you have a guy who's that incompetent in that kind of situation. So a lot of his sacks leave him more vulnerable on the outside just because he has to help the inside guy. And I'm not saying Reiff is some all-pro talent, but he isn't as horrendous as a lot of people are trying to make him out to be, I think. And because if you just look at his, like for instance, his Pro Football Focus grade was 71.2, and that was the best on our entire offensive line, because a lot of people would probably think that goes to O'Neal, where he did have a 70.8, but the real difference in the two sides is, if you look at him, Josh Klein is a veteran guard who is actually known as a pass protector and not so much a run blocker, which we saw. And the real big difference was Josh Klein, as he has since 2017 when Elflein first came into the league as a rookie, Josh Klein has allowed a total of 7 sacks. That's per PFF. And Elflein, on the other hand, has allowed a whopping 14 sacks on the interior, which once again is ridiculous. And then you get into the 2018 stuff even, where Tom Compton was lining up next to Riley Reiff. Tom Compton allowed 7 sacks and had a 61.8 grade, so that is all worse than Pat Elflein. And Riley still was able to post a 74.1 grade and only allowed 3 sacks, despite the fact that they were throwing about 47 times a game, it felt like. So, do we really need to solve Reiff, or do we just need to solve left guard? Because I'm kind of leaning towards the left guard, because another thing to kind of just remember here is the money situation. Because even if you want to go after a free agent tackle after cutting Riley Reiff, right? Because you only have $1.3 million. Is it a wise move to go get another guy who would likely be the same price as Riley Reiff, who I've just stated, unless you get Anthony Costanzo, probably will be around the same caliber of player And can you really expect a player to be a immediate day one starter at 25, given that it might be the 5th or 6th best tackle in the class? It's a very talented tackle class, but there's not much polish all the time. So you kind of have to ask yourself, is this something I would really want to do? Because now you already have that $1.3 million in cap space, which is from over the cap, and then you have a whole lot of roster turnover looming on the defensive side, and we know we have to replace Elflein no matter what it feels like, and then you almost have this option with Reiff. So is it wise to try to, replace an entire left side of your line while you're replacing most of your defense, which could involve 2 outside corners, maybe your nickel corner, potentially a star safety? You might have to move on from Lindvall. You might need a replacement for Shamar Stephen even, or at least get some kind of interior pass rusher in there as well. And there's a lot of moves that you would need to make that you may not get to. And this would just add on top of it. So I'm not sure that's really a good idea. Something I could see potentially making sense is Reiff restructuring his contract, much like how we saw Everson Griffin restructure last season, where you end up saving a bunch of money, but it kind of can get voided later on and, after the season. And it's kind of like almost understood that this might be his last season here, but you save all of the money and then he gets to stay. And you might see something similar to that as we did last year with Everson Griffin. But I do also want to leave in the notion that he could potentially be the left guard, given how this guard class isn't all that great anyway, and a lot of the talent is at tackle. So we could look at, even though they might not be necessarily ready, we could look at a rookie left tackle with Riley Reiff at left guard, which given the past 2 or 3 years, you might look at Reiff like he could be, there's a solid chance Reiff as a left guard could be the best left guard that we've had in a while, considering, even way back when the Fuzzco to left guard definitely didn't work. And Nick Easton, he didn't necessarily, I don't think he allowed a sack in 2017, but you saw run plays where he would just get blown up, and then it was a problem there when you're trying to be a running football team. So then he ends up getting hurt, and then you move on from him, and then Tom Compton comes in, and then he's, a dumpster fire. Then Elflein moves over from center to left guard, and then he's a dumpster fire. There is a legitimate chance that Reiff could be the best left guard we've had in a long time, just because of how bad the other one's been. Even though I don't like the idea of movement on the offensive line, this one could actually potentially make sense given all of the tackle talent is at tackle. Well, not all the talent is at tackle in this class and not guard. That's what I meant to say. And I'm thinking he should be on the roster in 2020, just not at his $13.2 million cap hit. I don't think that's going to fly. But I do think he should end up being on this roster just because he is good enough to, not replace. And I feel like if we have guys that we can keep that are good enough to not replace, we should try to keep them here just because of how much roster turnover is looming in the coming weeks here. And you are going to see a lot of this go kind of younger and cheaper. And, yeah... I'm thinking not replacing the entire left side of our entire offensive line would be nice to not do while we're doing all of that. Anyway, I'd like to know your comments down below. It's always appreciated. Liking and subscribing, also appreciated. And until next time, I bid you all adieu.